Welcome, everyone, to Athena's Rapid Fire Takes on Ethics and Compliance Issues. Our guest today is Eric Baldwin, an Executive Director of Tapestry Networks, a leading peer-to-peer network for board members, C-suite, and corporate leaders. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Well, I'm always happy to get the benefit of your insights, particularly on the challenges facing boards of directors today. But first, let's do 3 rapid-fire challenge statements. Are you ready?
Ready.
Boards of directors are focused primarily on financial results and helping companies to maximize short-term profitability.
No. The primary role of the board is oversight of company management to promote long-term success. And directors recognize that a culture of integrity and ethical and responsible behavior contribute to long-term shareholder value.
That makes sense. Second, effective board oversight means going beyond quarterly PowerPoint presentations and assessing whether management adheres to company values in practice.
Yes. The board members I've talked to are spending time reviewing employee surveys, digging into hotline data, and asking probing questions of management to get at the story behind the data, doing what they can to really get a better view into their company's culture.
I look forward to discussing that more. Third, hearing bad news as part of quarterly meetings is as important, if not more important, than positive results.
Absolutely, yes. Meaningful oversight has to include insight into problem areas, red flags, and misconduct, all of which can impact the company's operations and reputations. Boards want to hear bad news, and usually the sooner the better.
That's another good point. Well, let's do a deep dive into those areas to get the full benefit of your insights. You've been at Tapestry Networks for nearly 10 years and probably had interactions with thousands of board members. Tell us how the role of the board has changed and evolved over that period.
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll try to give a few points. I think one basic but important shift is that the job of being a board director is simply taking more time than it used to. There's certainly survey data out there to support that, and we've heard that anecdotally in our discussions with directors over the last several years. So there are more and more issues that are calling for board time and attention as new risks and challenges have emerged over the last several years. I'll mention a few things. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but technology oversight, especially of AI, is at the top of nearly every board agenda now. And AI was not a topic that was really even on the agenda 5, 6, 7 years ago. But today it's affecting strategy, operations, capital expenditure, workforce and talent issues. The list goes on. It's really integrated into everything boards are doing. And they're doing a lot of work to oversee their organization's approach to AI. And that's work they really weren't doing a few years ago. Relatedly, cybersecurity was probably an emerging risk issue 10 to 15 years ago, one that steadily moved up the agenda over the last decade. And then I think boards got more comfortable with their oversight of cybersecurity. It reached a kind of plateau. But then in the last 6 months, we've seen, with the emergence of AI models and their cyber capabilities, really put a lot of fear into boards. And cybersecurity has rocketed right to the top of the agenda. And then another set of issues over the last couple of years has been that the political and geopolitical landscape in which corporations operate has really shifted. And directors, especially those from large companies with global operations, are telling us that political and geopolitical risk are top issues, and they're spending a lot of time addressing those issues at the board. So they're incorporating geopolitics into their strategic and operational planning in new ways. And they're doing a lot more and more complex scenario planning in the face of all this geopolitical volatility. And last thing I'll mention here is CEO succession planning. Boards will tell you consistently that their top job, their number one job, is selecting and hiring the CEO. And with declining tenure among CEOs in recent years, increasing turnover, many boards are now recognizing that CEO and C-suite succession planning has to be a continuous process. It's not episodic. It's not something you do 2 to 3 years before you think your CEO is due to retire. It's integrated into board work consistently. So boards are spending more time assessing potential CEO candidates, C-suite candidates within the organization, identifying where they might need to grow, and working with management to identify the right developmental pathways. So I think those are a few issues that are kind of ratcheting up the time that boards spend, and at the same time, nothing is really falling off the agenda. It's kind of a one way ratchet. So boards are just definitely spending more time between meetings, doing prep work, engaging with management, working with investors. Um, and I think all of that increases the risk that ethics and compliance issues don't get the time and resources they need. Beyond the time issue, I'll mention a couple of other things. If you look over the last 10 years or so, we've seen the Me Too movement, the sort of racial reckoning in the wake of the death of George Floyd, obviously the COVID pandemic. ESG and sustainability issues have kind of come and gone on the agenda a little bit, and all of that has had an impact in the boardroom. Now, the attention to these issues has sort of ebbed and flowed over time, but they've definitely heightened the sense in boardrooms, I think, that corporations and their leaders have become more public and political, even political actors as opposed to just economic actors. And boards are finding the need to think through and advise their CEOs on whether and when and how to speak out on a public issue or a controversial issue, or how to respond to policy developments. And related to that, I think in general, public scrutiny has only increased of what companies and their boards are doing. And we're in an era of low and declining trust in large institutions. And so boards are very, very conscious of the reputational risks associated with any kind of scandal or ethics and compliance failing.
Well, it sounds like the perfect storm, and I think it is. So, within the perfect storm of all those issues, both political, ethical, and regulatory and technological, what does effective oversight look like? How can board members go beyond what's in their quarterly reports and get at the issues that significantly impact company operations?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say as background is that directors do recognize that oversight of ethics and compliance and corporate culture is a really significant challenge. It's one thing to track trading completions or compliance with basic regulatory requirements, but to understand whether employees, from the top of the organization down, are behaving ethically, whether you have a culture of integrity, whether employee behaviors really line up with stated values is another thing entirely and much more difficult. These things are inherently hard to measure, and the board in particular is not in a great position because they're at arm's length from the company. They have limited visibility into the company and its culture, and they're really dependent on management to give them that picture most of the time. But at the same time, directors recognize that the risks associated with ethics and compliance and the seriousness of the consequences of an ethical scandal or compliance failure are really, really high. One director contrasted oversight of ethics and culture with oversight of financial reporting. And he said that the risk and the consequences of a restatement or a material deficiency in financial reports is much, much lower and far less than the risk imposed by having an ethical crisis or a bad culture. But that the amount of time and energy spent on financial reporting and the kind of maturity of oversight there is far greater than the time spent on ensuring we have an ethical culture. So there's a real mismatch between the level of risk and the maturity of oversight structures when it comes to ethics and compliance. And to overcome that, I would say what I've heard from boards, a couple of things is it's really just about prioritizing these issues at the board level. So that means intentionally carving out time and space for them, clarifying board ownership and accountability. What committee has oversight? What kind of information should come to the board? Who do you want to hear from around ethics and compliance and cultural issues? What's the right cadence of reporting? So really just getting the kind of board oversight nitty gritty in place is I think the first thing. And then it's really about doing what boards do, which is asking questions, kind of pushing, probing, following up, digging into the data. So, board members I talk to want to hear not just data on hotline reports, but they want to actually see what people are saying. They want to dig into some of the qualitative responses, even from employee engagement surveys, and then take things like employee turnover and retention data and push management to identify for them where there might be patterns or hotspots that they need to pay attention to. as you know better than I, there's lots and lots of data that bears on ethics and compliance that boards have access to. But the challenge I've heard many times is really interpreting what all of that means. Like, what's the story that the data is telling you? And so that requires taking time with management to probe, to ask questions. And I think the better that management leaders can do on identifying and telling the story for their boards, the better they will be serving their boards.
I would agree. And with the perfect tsunami of complex issues such as AI and cybersecurity now back at the top of the list, that really compresses, I would think, the board's ability to deal with those issues in depth. But let's turn to one of the, I think, key issues here too, which is how does a board really persuade management to raise bad news as well as good news? And how do they create the conditions for hearing about problem areas, red flags, misconduct before they hit the newspapers, hopefully, or social media, I should say?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I've heard more than one director say if I open the newspaper or social media and hear about an issue and that's the first time I'm hearing about it, that's a big problem. But board members do worry that management, may be putting its best foot forward when reporting to the board and board meetings. I think that's only natural. But they do want to hear about potential problems, as I said at the top, and they want to hear early, even if management doesn't have a fully worked out answer to the issue or a solution to the problem or even a complete picture of what the problem is, if it's a serious issue. Boards are there to advise and support management, at least in part. And the earlier they're informed of issues, the better they're able to do that. When it comes to creating an environment and conditions where bad news can be surfaced, that's tricky, and there's no sort of real program, at least that I've heard. It's it sounds kind of like soft, but it's really about building relationships. And the key issue is building trust. I mean, that's the key element, I think. And boards, at least many of the directors I've talked to, recognize that they need to, in a sense, take the lead and do kind of explicit work of building trust with their management team. So to that end, I've heard board members talk about, quote unquote, making deposits in their relationships with executives by meeting with them between between cycles, making themselves available to management, just generally creating an environment where executives feel comfortable reaching out. One director, I've spoken to said that they have a relationship with their chief compliance officer where that person will just pick up the phone and call them anytime they have an issue that's emerging, a challenge, a question, something that's just bothering them. And so they've created that kind of informal relationship where communication can flow and there's trust to communicate bad news or emerging issues. That's hard to do. It takes time and it takes effort on the part of both sides. But I think from what I've heard from directors, it's absolutely critical to build those kind of relationships in that kind of environment.
And that also is a very good point, that directors need to be proactive in building those relationships out so that they do get the insights they need before they read about it in social media. Eric, this has been a wonderful conversation and lots of practical insights in it for boards, and best practices too. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and I hope we can have you again.
Thank you so much, Susan. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate the time.